episode of Break It Up. In this episode, I'm going to do a book review of Friends for 300 Years by Howard Brinton. Annoyingly, I took it back to the meeting house and didn't even think about that. I was taking and so I don't actually have the book, but I have made copious notes from which I'm going to be talking about this book, which really wasn't at all what I was thinking it was going to be. I'm not sure what I thought it was going to be, but it wasn't what I thought it was going to be either. Anyway, so we're going to talk about a little bit about who Howard Brinton is, a bit about why this book is so important. I think probably, certainly in the 20th century, it must be in the top, maybe even the top 5 of Quaker bestsellers, if you know what I mean. And maybe look about why that is, and just some of the main things that come up in it, because it's been really influential, especially in the liberal Quaker tradition, in terms of influencing 20th going into 21st century Quakerism. And just before we get going, I know there is a more updated version of the book on Friends for 350 years, which I have not read. So this is the original 1953 version that I've read, just because that was what was in the meeting house rather than any preference. So if anything's different from one to the other, then please let me know. That'd be quite interesting. I do want to read that as well, but just so you know, I'm looking at the 1953 version. So before we get started, as I said, who was Howard Brinton? So he was born in America, so he's an American Quaker who lived between 1884 and 1974. So, that entire period where, from a British standpoint, liberal Quakerism was really coming to the fore. And he's often been described as one of the leading liberal Quaker theologians of the 20th century. Someone who he admired very much, which I'll talk about later as well. He is an academic. He studied at Harvard and Berkeley, and he was made his degrees were mainly in maths and sciences. And it's in the sciences that I think that really kind of comes through in terms of Friends for 300 Years. So I think slightly more important than the maths, for this book at least. And I suppose this is also what links him to the early modern liberal Quaker movement, which was trying to look at linking Quakerism with the sciences. So you can see why his angle, coming from his academic background. He was married to Anna Cox Brinton, who was a heavyweight Quaker of herself. She was a direct descendant of the founders of the Beanite Quakers, Joel and Hannah Bean, who founded Beanite Quakers in California after being ousted from their meetings by evangelical Quakers in, I think that was in the mid 1800s. But one of his main focuses was, as with others of this generation and of this movement, the early modern liberal Quaker. That's so hard to say. The early modern liberal Quaker movement was on education. He wanted education not educate not only newcomers to Quakerism, but also long timers, in actually educating them about what their faith meant. I think the thing that Howard Brinton is best known for, probably today, is how with him you start to get the categorization and understanding of Quaker testimony. So in Friends for 300 Years, he designates the term testimony to the outward witness of Quakers. And interestingly, whereas today in Britain, we probably talk about step in terms of categorizing those testimonies, so simplicity, truth, equality, peace. And I know the Americans favor spices, which has that, as well as other things as well. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what they stand for. But in Howard Brinton's book, which is the first book where this is really put forward, he doesn't actually talk about either of those two phrases. Don't come up, and certainly he uses different words. So he uses community, harmony, equality, and simplicity. So those are the first embryonic testimonies as we probably would understand them today. Now, obviously, this isn't to say that testimonies didn't exist before 1953, obviously not. But I think this is probably the first time that they have been so openly systematized by a theologian, for better or for worse. I think one of the major differences between maybe our understanding, or certainly our phrasing, of our testimonies today and his original conception of them, is looking at the difference between peace and harmony. And I'm kind of with Howard Brinton on this one. I prefer the term harmony overall to peace because he sort of says that peace can be misunderstood um, as pacifism, as weak, as passive, whereas that's not actually what Quakers are when they say that they have a testimony for peace. It's not just about saying that you refuse to fight, but that you're looking to actively engage in dialogue between enemies and removing the occasion for war, as is so often said, which I think fits a lot more with the idea of harmony necessarily than peace. Obviously, both good, but I think in terms of terminology, I prefer harmony. But what he comes to, and I think is something that maybe sometimes we can forget as 21st century Quakers, is that these testimonies cannot be taken out of isolation from themselves. They're not. It's not simply an ethos that we're looking to live under. They're heavily influenced by Quaker spirituality and a deep understanding of Quaker spirituality, and you can't take one away from the other. As a bit of an aside, as I mentioned before, this book is very, very popular. And as such, as all very popular Quaker theological books are, it has been lauded as the new apology, as in focusing on Robert Barclay's book, The Apology, rather than any old apology, which is effectively the highest praise that anyone can give a Quaker theological book. So the Apology was written in the 17th century by the second generation Quaker, Robert Barclay, as I just said. And it was effectively a very in-depth, systematic theology of Quakerism, basically a manual where he basically put forward all of the cases for Quakerism in the standard systematic format, as has become very popular at that time, starting, I think, originally with Thomas Aquinas way back when, but had been used as a way to categorize and systematize your belief on God. So this is what and Christianity and everything. So this is how he formulated his book in exactly that same format. And because of that, because it's so rigorous, its clout amongst Quakers probably remains high. I mean, if you're looking at solely Quaker theological texts, that must be bookseller number one, surely. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time just maybe picking at that analogy a little bit, and in terms of Quakers always calling the next great work of theology, the next apology. I've seen it not just for this book, but for loads of others as well. And I just think, and it's not to say, obviously, that I think the apology is better than Friends for 300 Years or anything like that. Absolutely not. It's more that I think the phrase is just very useless. Firstly, obviously, the books are completely different from one another. They were from completely different cultures, time periods. Even the motives for them for writing the books are different. The style is very different. Obviously, the apology was originally written in Latin, and the length is obviously different as well. And the apology is humongous. I suppose the similarities are they're both about Quaker theology, and they're both very well written. But I think that's probably where the similarities end. I suppose this is maybe Quaker sales tactic. I don't know, sort of like when you read a fantasy book and it says, oh, it's the next Lord of the Rings or the next Game of Thrones, or the Game of Thrones is the next Lord of the Rings. And I suppose it's all to like garner interest, and I understand that. But I mean, how many of I think that's probably a good example, actually. I mean, how many? I mean, maybe if you don't read fantasy books as much as I do, then maybe you don't see that. But I see it all the time. Like every single new fantasy, oh, it's the new Lord of the Rings, or it's the new Game of Thrones. But how often has that actually been true? Either it's either the book is going to be exactly like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, in which case, where's the originality? Why would I be interested in that? Or it's nothing like them at all, or not as good, and the readership's disappointed because they said it was going to be the next Lord of the Rings, and it's not. And so, bit of an aside on the aside, but I think going back to it's the next Barclay's Apology analogy. I think it devalues the work ultimately, because it's for the same reason. It kind of says either it's unoriginal or just an updating of a classic, or conversely, it devalues the apology by saying, well, it's relatively easy to emulate and it needs updating because it's outdated and has loads of silly thoughts that aren't relevant anymore, which is not necessarily untrue either. See Berkeley on the arts and acting and music, but I think ultimately, in terms of his theological points, I don't think they need. Well, you get my point. I don't think that it's something that I don't want to. I think such statements could devalue the apology by saying that it's just a somewhat rusty old book which we don't need anymore. So to end the rant on that, um, Friends for 300 Years is an excellent book. Robert Barclay's Apology is also an excellent book. They're nothing alike, however. I could like both, and let's just not even put them together because they're very different. So I've kind of read Friends for 300 Years in tandem with reading Helen Holt's recent biography of Rufus Jones, and the similarities are very striking. But then that is not a surprise considering they knew each other. I will do a book. I'll do a video on reviewing her book as well because I think that was really excellent. But so they did know each other. So, for example, it was Jones who suggested the topic of Jakob Böhme, the German mystic in the 16th century, as the topic for his dissertation, for his doctorate. And I think it's very clear that he's very taken with the Rufus Jones approach to certainly the mystical origins of Quakerism. So I'll go into this other video as well. But basically, this is the idea that Rufus Jones believed that Quakerism was not based from Puritan Reformed theology, but instead from this continental mysticism or Christian mysticism that was going on with figures like Jakob Böhme and Meister Eckhart and people like that. And if you want to read more about that, obviously do check out Helen Holt's biography. But go into the Roundtree History series and maybe Studies in Mystical Religion, where he really goes into that and in very, very heavy detail. But if you want a really good, robust understanding of where he believes Quakerism came from, then that would be probably the place to go. What's important, though, is that by the time that Howard Brinton is writing this in 1953, these beliefs are starting to be quite heavily scrutinized and criticized by Quaker historians. So, yet Howard Brinton, for the most part, just carries on with it. It seemingly is something that he did believe, and that's very clear in the book. And I think it influences not only the actual introduction to the book, where he makes that quite clear that he believes that Quakerism came from this sort of mystical wellspring of Christianity rather than from Reformed theology, but also actually in his theology, the theology which he describes in the book, which I'm going to get to. So, as I mentioned before, one of Brinton's main purposes for writing was that he wanted to educate Quakers, especially when it came to theology, because as quite a lot of people of that time were realizing, was that Quakers didn't really know why they did what they did, or they weren't able to articulate that clearly or academically in any way. It's often said that Quakers have a prejudice against theology because it's putting rational thought onto a divine experience. However, I think you have. I don't think he mentions it very clearly, but I think you have to bear in mind that he is speaking when he speaks of Quaker theology. He is speaking as an early modern liberal Quaker, and so therefore his theology is also very liberal and of that strand, which I don't think he makes clear. Obviously, he wouldn't know that he's an early modern, so I wouldn't. But in terms of the liberal aspect of his Quakerism, he doesn't make that necessarily very clear, and it makes it seem, if you read that book, that this is the only type of Quakerism out there, which is obviously not the case. There would be, I'm sure, quite a lot of that evangelical friends would have a lot of things to say to. Conservative Quakers probably similarly. And actually, I know that there's a difference between the American version and the British version, where the British version doesn't have all of the American schisms in there or anything like that. So actually, from a British perspective, not knowing anything about Quakerism, not knowing anything about Howard Brinton and his theological biases, bias, then you wouldn't necessarily know. And I think that's a bit that's not so great from a pedagogical standpoint, I'd say, because I think other books like A Living Faith by Will Cooper, for example, um, goes well probably into way too much detail in weighing up the different groups and or even Introduction to Quakerism by Pink Dandelion. Um, they go into very much the differences between those different groups. So I suppose it's nice not to have those aspects, that sort of confusing aspect of they believe this, they believe that, they believe that, and what's the difference? He just plows on. Quakers believe this. So there's traditional Quaker Christianity, for example, which is again a book on theology, but it's published by Ohio Yearly Meeting Conservative, and it makes it very clear right from the outset that this is the conservative understanding or the conservative Quaker understanding of theology, whereas Howard Brinton doesn't necessarily do that. So I think probably a bit, not a trigger warning, so to speak, but I think maybe just to highlight that this is liberal Quaker theology, which is by no means the mainstream at all globally of Quaker theology. So in terms of how he describes his theology, he doesn't actually go through it in like Robert Barclay did, so it's not like the apology then, is it? He doesn't go through it systematically. He kind of takes the angle of Quakerism as a method of experiencing the divine, and so looks at the individual first, then looks at the meeting, and then looks at the world. And I know that I can kind of imagine my Lutheran friends or something having a world of beef with that. But I think if you're going to do Quaker theology, I think it has to be done like that, and I think you just have to accept that that's going to be very different to how maybe a more liturgical creedal Christian might do it. But I don't think necessarily that it's wrong, nor do I think that it's involving or making it all about the individual first and foremost. I think it's just that's where you need to start, because if you're using it as a method, you can't go all the way and apply that to the world straight away if you haven't even applied it to yourself. So I think it does make sense. I know that that is going to get some criticism from people, but I think he follows it through very well. I think it's very highly effective, actually, how he does it. Because the thing is, so in normal systematic theology, you start with God the Father and then move that way. And the thing is, with especially with liberal Quakerism, that's a non-starter. And I think even at the point of writing in Howard Brinton's time, that's a hard place to start for Quakers, because that's not where Quakerism doesn't work that way. So we have to basically find a way of talking maybe systematically about it without using the normal systematics that the Reformed are famous for using. So the two chapters where he really talks about this is the light as experienced and the light as thought about. So in these chapters, he's looking at trying to explain how Quakers develop their ideas, both and look at them both theologically and intellectually as well. And I like the idea of the light as thought about. You could have easily have said something like the theology of the inner light or something like that, or the inward light as he calls it. But I think if he's trying to engage these liberal Quakers, maybe using the word theology as a sort of a no word. That way, no one can argue with thought and how the light is thought about, even though that's precisely what it is theology. You can't deny it, but it's a much nice sort of softly approach into that, maybe for those theologically adverse Quakers. He does a fantastic job with bringing in, in order to back up what he's talking about. He does a really good job in talking about the experiences of early friends. And when I say early friends, I don't just mean like the ones that everyone knows and the quotes that come up all the time. So really, really diverse look at those early Quakers, going beyond just the household names. You know what I mean? Of Fox, Penn, Berkeley, and Pennington. He goes into a lot more depth in terms of looking at a wide array of those early Quakers instead of the patriarchs, so to speak. And I think for Quakers, certainly for his audience at least, I think, yes, there will certainly be some Quakers who, at that time, who were adverse to theology, but pretty much all Quakers, Quakers have had a very long history of being really involved with journals of early Quakers and, treating those resources quite reverently. Obviously, not as, holy texts or anything, but as guidelines for experiences and just engage with the with previous generations of Quakerism. And I found this really helpful actually at looking at how those early Quakers understood areas of theology, helped to make it seem quite not just more convincing as well, but I think the connection between Quakers throughout time just felt a very quite very close in a way that if you just read about the early Quakers, you tend to often get the sense about how different they were and how how much more radical they were and all those sort of things. When actually, I think from this I got a great sense that actually I think I would have a lot in common with those early Quakers. Although I like listening to music and I watch TV. If you want to obviously read Friends for 300 Years, but I mean, if you want to read more on or listen as well to some of these journals, and maybe as I said, some of the ones more off the beaten path that you wouldn't be able to necessarily find easily. If you go to, there's a Friends Library have put out an app where they've basically put loads of journals from early Quakers. Some of them are audio, so you can listen to them, but there are many more which are just just written down. So if you're interested in reading a wider variety of early Quakers, then if you just look for the Friends Library app, you can have a vast resource there. Another thing that I find quite interesting with Friends for 300 Years is how Brinton measures the different impacts and influences on a Quaker and Quaker theology. So he puts them into like an XY axis and separated them basically between um, maybe outward signs of Quaker faith and inward signs of Quaker faith. So you'd have evangelical and humanitarian aspects on the y-axis, and then mystical and rational aspects of Quaker practice. So the inward signs going on the x-axis, and or invertedly, I can't remember which way around it was, but he uses this model basically to explain that it's necessary in Quakerism to have a rounded Quaker faith is to be somewhere in the middle of all of that, and that where the schisms led to, and this is where I think maybe a bit of his bias is coming out. The schisms are basically a lacking, or the schismatics um, noticing a lack of one of those four strands, and that led to the schism that they were then trying to pull that one out. But then obviously, if you pull it more this way, then something else is lacking. And I thought the visual was quite nice. I'm not sure whether nowadays that might be considered too simplistic, but I thought it was at least I quite liked that simpler approach to looking at Quaker schism, which otherwise can be quite a daunting task. I think also with that, so evangelical, humanitarian, mystical, and rational. I mean, it's going to be very unlikely that you're all four of those perfectly. So everyone's going to be a bit different. Um, and I think that actually there's a lot of value in recognizing your own strengths on out of those four as well. Where are you more? But I think probably what he might mean more is that if you look at it as a society as a whole, then the whole society should be a measure of these things. And obviously, yeah, people are going to be better at some than others. He then ha- he then has he basically breaks these down into superhuman levels, human levels, and subhuman levels. So the mystical and the evangelical aspects of the faith are superhuman, because they are beyond humanity. They require help from God or the divine in order to do them well, to evangelize and to be mystical. You can't do that solely by yourself. You need the participation of the inward light for that. The layer below this would be the human level, and that's where the rational side and the humanitarian side comes in, because these aims are towards a moral good, and can be attained by human action alone. Which again, I think I have issues with, and I know many other theologians would probably have issues with, because one would say that, well, where you gain those moral views from, if not from the divine, if that's your worldview. But we'll go with it. And so then the third and the bottom layer of that, the subhuman level, which again, wording I don't particularly enjoy, um, is where humans only look in on themselves, so the individualism, with no wider awareness of to humanity or even the divine, um, and he places vitalism and materialism there. So vitalism, so like that's sort of like the egocentric, it's all about me. It's sort of the inward manifestation on that, and the outward manifestation of that would be materialism. So he would then claim, if you're looking at that, how that looks as a society, then we're mostly at that subhuman level where we worship ourselves as gods, or the self as God, and only value the world in how it affects us, which I do see. I'm not against that necessarily. I think I find it I think I find it all a bit heavy-handed. Maybe this is why I think maybe reading 350 years might be better. And of course, yeah, what I think I do understand is that he wants there to be a sort of divinely imbued society, and what that would look like, and aiming towards those humanitarian and um, mystical aims of a wider society, I think would be obviously better than one that's based on materialism and egocentrism. As I said, I think maybe it's just a bit simplistic, maybe not the word, but I think maybe just, I don't know, I think maybe we've just moved on. It's obviously a different time. So, what actually is his theology then? So, how does Brinton describe Quaker theology? Um, as I said before, he does pretty much toe the line of those early modern liberal Quakers. He does it in quite a different way to other writers of that time. So if you're looking at Jones or Braithwaite or Rowntree, my favorite, due to his knowledge of these early Quaker journals, I don't think necessarily the others really go into that sort of detail. And also the sciences as well, which is something that he knows a lot more about um, than certainly Rowntree and maybe Braithwaite. I don't know if Braithwaite had anything to do with the sciences. Rufus Jones obviously focused a lot of his time on psychology, um, so going into the sciences there, but he's got a much more robust understanding, and so can bring that in terms of his theology. So he makes constant reference throughout his book to the scientific method and scientific experimentation to show that actually liberal Quakerism can be held can be held as a justifiable faith of the 20th century, um, because they affirm the science, and so he certainly affirms the sciences over maybe the old evangelical religion of the previous generation, which is very in vogue at the time, although maybe going out of vogue now, but by 1953. But certainly, with Rufus Jones and Rowntree, that's very much what they were what they were getting at. Similarly, like with those big names as well, he also makes a lot of references to other religious cultures as well. So he mainly talks about those from China or India, um, sort of opening the table to a more universalist idea of liberal Quakerism, which obviously will become pretty much mainstream by the 21st century. So on the Bible, then, Brinton asserts that the Bible is not the central authority, um, but rather that God, who gave meaning to the scriptures, and only through him can they be understood. So I think, uh, which is, I think, has always been the Quaker position. Well, has certainly been a major Quaker position. I know there are some Quakers that don't believe that, but and the Bible itself is not inerrant. The Bible is a book, but the idea that if you read it, um, with the help of the inward light, that you will be able to, that it can be divinely inspired, but it's not in of itself completely right. I think Robert Barclay and actually Joseph Phipps, who are not so well known Quaker theologian, but he in his book The Original and Present State of Man, I think he gives a slightly better understanding of this than Brinton does here. But then, as I said, it's meant to be probably maybe a bit introductory. He notes, however, that the scriptures are useful to save Quakerism from pure individualism and to guide leadings of the spirit in ministry. So he's saying that it certainly is useful and to keep it from being a religion solely about that the sort of vitalism that he was talking about, or egocentrism. It stops it from being that by giving it this anchor, this root, but otherwise is not inerrant. Interestingly, and probably a slight difference from Rufus Jones, is that Brinton does not link the inward light or the inner light with the conscience in the same way that Rufus Jones does, where those do very much blend in his understanding. Whereas he would say that the light illuminates the conscience, but is not a part of it. So, so in the apology, I'm bringing it up a lot now, aren't I? God, so in Robert Barclay's apology, he would talk about like a lantern, um, whereby the lantern is the conscience and the candle is the light. Yeah, that's the way around. Yeah. And he links this with reason as well. Like, you can have divine reason. So if you take reason away from the light, in the same way if you take conscience away from the light, then that's where you end up with individualism and tyranny. So that's all quite, I'd say, standard Quaker approach, and moving away maybe from the melding of the light and conscience. He does have quite a universalist view of Quakerism, that everyone, by which I mean or a pluralist view of the Quaker faith, in that it doesn't need to be simply about Jesus and knowing the name Jesus. That you could be a Quaker without ever hearing Jesus or know anything about Jesus. So he brings up the classic Quaker text of John 1 verse 9, of the true light which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. And so it's not simply about hearing the name Jesus and knowing your sin and being forgiven by and all that sort of stuff. It's anyone can be saved. So a universalist view of salvation, and that people don't need to be Christian in order to experience the light. So Brinton talks a little bit about the debate between the historic Christ and the inward Christ, or the eternal Christ. And this isn't just a Quaker hang-up, although it certainly has been. You can look at this in some of the early, even the very early heresies of Christianity. So Arianism, monophysism, that one. And basically, if Jesus is both fully man and fully divine, there's always a tendency for a group of people to focus more on one and more on the other. And in Quakerism, this has been true as well. And there was also there was a sort of kind of mini schism with George Keith, known as the Keithian controversy, where this came into where this sort of trying to equal out or understand this figure of a historical Jesus and an eternal inward Christ. How do they fit together? That affected trying to work that out affected Quakerism as well. So George Keith, who was actually, so this was way back in the 17th century, but he was very much a heavyweight in the early Quaker movement, and but he believed ultimately he did break away and formed his own religious society, and then I think became an Anglican. But the reason for his leaving was that he believed that Quakers focus too much on the inward Christ, as in the inward light. over the historic Christ. So so not focusing too much on his sacrifice on the cross and things like that. And so Brinton says that there ought to be no friction between the two in Quakerism, and I think probably wider Christians probably would say the same. I've got a quote here which I'm going to read out, so bear with me. The uniqueness of Jesus, according to the Christian faith, consists in the fact that he was the supreme revelation of God in human terms. Since the light within is God revealing himself to man, Jesus of Nazareth was God revealing himself to history. Without the historical revelation, the inner revelation would be incomplete. So every event, I suppose, in Quakerism can be seen to have not only an outward form, but also an inward form as well. He looks at how Quakerism fits in with Christian theology by breaking it down into looking at Greco-Roman Christianity and Hebrew Christianity, which again I'm not very comfortable with. I think that can go down some very troubling routes in terms of how you understand Christianity. But his angle is that Quakerism can fit in with both of these. So he presents Hebrew Christianity as focused on ethics, that God came down to have a relationship with humanity, that religion is historical, versus a more Greco-Roman perspective, which focuses on good action, that man looks up to have a relationship with God, and that religion is eternal. He goes one step further, again, not necessarily something I agree with, but saying that Catholicism kind of reflects more the Greco-Roman tradition of Christianity, with a greater focus on like Aristotle and Plato in its theology, whereas Protestantism largely rejects Aristotle and focuses more on the ethics of Christianity, so the more the Hebrew side, as he calls it. As I said, I'm not very comfortable with that really. His point though is that Quakerism takes the inner light and the seeking of truth from the Greco-Roman tradition, and the vitality of that prophetic encounter with God from the Hebrew tradition. For me, I think this is seems very simplistic, um, and I can imagine that neither Catholics nor Protestants more widely would feel very happy with those definitions at all. I think maybe a more important point that he makes, or like something which I find quite interesting, is he kind of Brinton tackles the idea of whether or not Quakerism is simply a Johannine movement, as in focusing entirely on the Gospel of John, and kind of ignoring the synoptic gospels and focusing only on John, which is certainly a criticism that was placed before Quakers in the early days, that it ignored most of the Bible and focused entirely on the Bible on the Gospel of John. And so he says that, and he actually agrees with this, which I do not, saying that the that Quakerism fits easier with the Gospel of John and the epistles of Paul, so the Greco-Roman tradition, if you will, um, than the Old Testament and the Synoptic Gospels, which he would brand the Hebrew tradition. But I think there are lots of examples which shows that Quakerism takes into account the full scriptures to explain its theology. Barclay certainly does that, and I think narrowing it down in that way seems not. I don't understand why you would do that. I think this is definitely the aspect of the book that I find the most difficult and things I don't really agree with, because he kind of contradicts himself. So he says on the one hand that he feels that Quakerism fits perfectly with this Greco-Roman tradition and this Hebrew tradition, but that actually Quakerism is more focusing on the Gospel of John, so a Johannine, and therefore Greco-Roman tradition, than with the Synoptic Gospels and the Old Testament, which I think one, it's inconsistent and with his own logic, and is very uncomfortable, I think, as an idea. So I think this moves on then to his idea on the atonement then. So the atonement obviously is the passion of Jesus and the Easter story, what that means in terms of his resurrection, or what he was doing on the cross, like what's is going on there. So he believes, which I think is fine, that it has historic, temporal, and outward meaning, but also that it's internal, that has an internal and an eternal meaning as well. So he sees the crucifixion as a point in time where the eternal and the temporal come together. And I've got another quote here, so again, bear with me. This sacrifice was not made simply to show men on earth the way to reconciliation with God, though that was part of the meaning. It occurred also as an essential part of the eternal process itself. I mean, it's something that I've certainly considered, the idea that although the crucifixion happened once in history, that kind of the repercussions of that are permanently going on. So it's both a temporal event and an eternal event. I've certainly been thinking of that. And he says that Quakers have tended to err on that sort of internal, eternal side of the crucifixion and the atonement than looking at the historical event and the meaning of the historical event. But again, I would probably argue against this and say, well, actually, I think that doesn't take into account that a lot of the 19th century was basically, especially in America, was basically American Quakers getting all worked up about about propitiatory atonement and what that meant and things. So that led to quite a lot of the schisms. Obviously, in Britain, we were all about that at that time as well. That sort of atonement theology, which it kind of goes against this idea that Quakers never thought about the historical event at all and only focused on the internal event. He also talks about perfectionism. And so perfectionism is the idea that, or the possibility, I suppose, that man can be, or that humanity can be without sin in this life. I think it's rather contentious within Christianity, and Quakers have found this a difficult concept as well. I suppose it's essentially, in a way, it's the logical conclusion to the idea of following the inward light, right? So if you grow in righteousness and have a greater and greater communication with the light, and you follow what it says, it follows that eventually you'll become sinless because you'll always do what it says, and obviously it can't lead you into sin. So happy days. But there are quite a lot of caveats here, though. Such as the idea of free will, that people can fall away. So that though perfectionism or perfection might be reached, you might not be able to persevere because of free will. You might decide, actually, no, I don't want to do what the inner light's telling me to do today. So Robert Barclay famously said that although he believes it's possible, he doesn't believe anyone but Christ has actually attained that. George Fox, obviously one of the main founders of Quakers, certainly a first generation Quaker versus maybe Robert Barclay as a second generation Quaker, said that it must be possible. And so he had a quote that I've also found, which went like this: "It's a sad and comfortless sort of striving to strive with a belief that we should never overcome." And so I think Brinton does get around this quite nicely by focusing on another Quaker phrase, which is the measure of one's light. So this would mean that some people have greater access to the light than others, so they're more attuned to the inward light than others are, and though perhaps no one has reached the full access that you would need in order to be perfect and sinless, but we all must live up to the measure of light that we do have. So I think this moves on quite nicely to Brinton's idea on the right form of Quaker worship, which, although he doesn't state it as a liberal Quaker, this obviously means he favors silent worship as opposed to programmed worship or pastoral worship. And yeah, though, as I said, this is not the main type of Quakerism that is done worldwide. And this was certainly quite a big preoccupation. I was surprised by this, with how much of a preoccupation this was for John William Rowntree. He really, what a lot of the reasons why he wanted to educate people was because he was all for the free ministry, that ministers should not be paid, and that there shouldn't be a leading pastor. So he kind of is in line with, as I said, those early modern Quakers there. So he says that that what happens in meeting is that in a silent meeting for worship, the individual must experience both withdrawal from the world and then both a return to the world. So this withdrawal and return idea. This dynamic, I think, is very important, and you see that a lot in Quaker writings and Quaker action and Quaker life as a Quaker. You do see that idea that that sort of mystical experience then has a natural conclusion or action in the real world, so to speak. Because I think the temptation is with especially with the idea of mysticism, which is certainly something that he thinks, or Brinton thinks, that Quakerism comes from, that there's a temptation with mysticism that it becomes a form of aestheticism, that you remove yourself from the world entirely. So, yeah, and if you do that and you remove yourself from the world just to converse with God, but you never come back from that, then that doesn't bear any real fruit apart from for the individual, and there's no power in that apart from sort of the individualistic. Whereas the return to the real world gives the individual the ability to share those fruits, to um, share what they've learned, to help create the kingdom of God and love their neighbor. You can't love your neighbor if you never see your neighbor. And with a religion like Quakerism, which there's a strong focus on individual experience, Quakerism um, has to be really careful that it isn't lost in individualism. There has to be a corporate aspect as well, to enhance that experience, to make meaning of that experience, but also where necessary to provide sort of a sounding wall against, to make sure that any leadings are true leadings and not just voices in your head. But similarly, kind of going back to his sort of XY axis, um, a, a spirituality that's focused solely on action, even when it's humanitarian and benefiting the world. But if there's no spiritual depth, then it can lose momentum, lose direction. So again, I think Brinton sees these extremes and sees the Quaker meeting for worship as a way to balance those two. So, in summary, I think there's a lot. It's a beast of a book. There's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot that I disagree with. But I think it's an important piece of work, and packed with good early liberal Quaker theology, in an interesting format. And obviously, as I said, the first real emergence of a system for Quaker testimonies. And and I was thinking of this, I was thinking, gosh, I've talked a lot about this book, and I remember it's only 200 pages long, so it does an awful lot in an awful little amount of time. And I think it's certainly probably a book which, maybe because it's modern as well, as in it, I would feel unable to really criticize Robert Barclay or George Fox. One, because they're so close to the source, but also because we're arguing from completely different times. Whereas I suppose still, although obviously I would also argue that obviously 1953, we're way beyond 1953 now, and culture has changed a lot even in that short amount of time comparatively. I still feel able to maybe criticize Brinton in a way that I would feel unable to criticize George Fox and Robert Barclay, and so there certainly are things that I would criticize. I think his a lot of his things are don't really add up, but I think, as I said, for it packs a punch for 200 pages, so I would really recommend you read it. I think I would then supplement it with writings from other early modern liberal Quakers like Rufus Jones and John Wilhelm Rowntree, or maybe just John Wilhelm Rowntree. But it's going to be very interesting, because obviously within my lifetime we'll be looking at Friends for 400 years, and what will that look like? What would we include there? What would be the additions? What would be the changes? What would be maybe the removals of that? And I suppose actually probably more pertinent question is, in what way is Friends for 350 years different? I should probably get away and go and read that and then compare. But anyway, join me next time for that. Otherwise, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.